Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1987, a demolition crew working on an abandoned farmhouse in Stone County, Missouri, made a discovery that would force authorities to confront horrors nearly 8 decades old. Beneath the original floorboards of the structure, wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth, workers found a sealed metal box containing dozens of letters in various states of preservation. The correspondence, dated between 1908 and 1910, revealed a relationship between two individuals that defied moral comprehension and suggested that several deaths from that era, previously attributed to natural causes or accidents, were something far more sinister. The letters documented an arrangement between a man and a woman, both respected professionals in their communities, who shared desires so aberrant that even today investigators struggle to discuss the case without visible discomfort. What these two individuals did to the bodies entrusted to their care, and what they may have done to ensure a steady supply of subjects for their compulsions, represents one of the darkest chapters in Ozark criminal history. The southern Missouri Ozarks in the early 20th century was a region of profound isolation. Rugged hills covered in dense oak and pine forests separated small communities by miles of primitive roads that became impassable during winter months and spring rains. Families lived and died with minimal contact from the outside world, and professionals who served these scattered populations operated with virtually no oversight. It was in this landscape of isolation and implicit trust that two predators found each other, recognized their shared affliction, and formed a pact that would desecrate the dead and possibly claim the lives of the living. For nearly 80 years, their secrets remained buried beneath those floorboards, protected by time and obscurity. What follows is the documented account of what those letters revealed and the investigation that finally brought the truth into the unforgiving light. The farmhouse stood approximately 3 miles northeast of Galena, a weathered 2-story structure that had sat vacant for over 15 years following the death of its last occupant. In September 1987, a construction company contracted to demolish the building and clear the land for agricultural use began the process of dismantling the structure. On the morning of September 14th, workers removing the original pine floorboards in what had been the front parlor discovered a rectangular metal box wedged between the floor joists. The box, approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, had been wrapped in oilcloth that had partially deteriorated over the decades but still provided substantial protection from moisture. Foreman William Garrett later described the moment of discovery to investigators, stating that the box was positioned deliberately and had clearly been hidden with care rather than accidentally lost. When Garrett pried open the corroded lid, he found dozens of folded papers, letters written in ink that had faded but remained largely legible. His initial assumption was that the letters were old family correspondence of potential historical interest, and he made the decision to contact the Stone County Historical Society rather than discarding them with the rest of the debris. Eleanor Marsh, the Society's chief archivist, arrived at the demolition site that afternoon and took possession of the box and its contents. She began her examination that evening in her office, carefully unfolding the fragile papers and attempting to organize them by date. Within an hour, Marsh understood that she was reading something far beyond routine historical correspondence. The letters, exchanged between two individuals who identified themselves only by first initials, contained descriptions of activities so disturbing that Marsh found herself unable to continue reading. Her hands trembling, she telephoned Sheriff Daniel Reeves at his home and informed him that she had discovered evidence of what she believed were serious crimes, regardless of how long ago they had occurred. By the following morning, the Missouri State Bureau of Investigation had to understand how such crimes could occur undetected for years, one must first comprehend the nature of Stone County, Missouri in the early 20th century. The 1,908 1900 census recorded a population of approximately 11,000 residents scattered across 463 square miles of rugged Ozark terrain. The economy depended primarily on lead mining operations in the northern portions of the county, timber harvesting throughout the densely forested hills, and subsistence farming in the narrow valleys between limestone ridges. Communities such as Galena, Crane, and Blue Eye existed as small clusters of homes and businesses separated by miles of primitive roads that wound through hollows and over steep grades. During periods of heavy rain or winter snow, these roads became impassable for days or weeks at a time, effectively isolating residents from the outside world. The nearest significant town was Springfield, located over 40 miles to the north, a journey that could take an entire day by wagon under favorable conditions. Law enforcement in Stone County consisted of a single sheriff and 1 or 2 deputies responsible for patrolling hundreds of square miles of difficult terrain. Sheriff Amos Whitfield, who held the position from 1904 to 1912, operated from a small office in Galena and relied heavily on local citizens to report crimes and disturbances. Investigations were hampered by distance, limited communication, and the cultural tendency of Ozark residents to handle matters privately rather than involve outside authorities. It was within this environment of isolation and minimal oversight that 2 individuals conducted their professions and eventually found each other. Vernon Acker was a 34-year-old undertaker who had operated his funeral parlor in Galena since 1901, serving families throughout the county with what all accounts described as professionalism and dignity. Cordelia Finch was a 28-year-old widow who worked as a midwife in the community of Blue Eye, approximately 12 miles southeast of Galena, attending births and frequently preparing bodies for burial in the remote areas she served. Both were respected members of their communities with no apparent history of scandal or misconduct. The 1987 investigation assembled a detailed portrait of Vernon Acker from county records, census data, and interviews with descendants of Galena residents who preserved family memories of the man. Vernon Edward Acker was born in St. Louis in 1874, the second son of German immigrants who had established a successful funeral business in the city. His father, Heinrich Acker, trained both sons in the mortuary trade, and Vernon worked as an assistant in the family business throughout his 20s. In 1901, at the age of 27, Vernon departed St. Louis and traveled south to Stone County, where he purchased a building on the main street of Galena and established his own funeral parlor. The reasons for his departure from St. Louis were never clearly documented, though one letter from 1909 contained a cryptic reference to an incident that made it necessary for him to seek a location where he was not known. His establishment in Galena consisted of a 2-story wooden structure with the funeral parlor and preparation rooms on the ground floor and his personal residence above. He equipped the facility with modern embalming equipment and maintained a small stable for the hearse and horses. Within a year of his arrival, Acker had established himself as the primary undertaker for Galena and surrounding communities, known for providing dignified services at prices that working families could afford. A photograph discovered in the Stone County Historical Society archives shows a tall, slender man with dark hair parted precisely in the center, a trimmed mustache, and pale eyes that the original photographer had noted seemed to look through rather than at the camera. Interviews conducted in 1987 with elderly residents and descendants of Galena families painted a consistent picture of Acker's public persona. He was described as courteous and professional in all dealings, soft-spoken and meticulous in his work, but notably reserved in social situations. He rarely attended community gatherings, church functions, or civic events, explaining when asked that his profession required him to remain available at all hours for families in need. Cordelia Finch's history proved more difficult to reconstruct than Vernon Acker's, owing to incomplete records and the deliberate obscuring of her trail after 1910. She was born Cordelia May Marsh in 1,880 inches, Berry County, Missouri, the daughter of a farmer and his wife who supplemented the family income by serving as the local midwife. Cordelia learned the trade from her mother beginning in adolescence, attending her first birth at the age of 14 and gradually assuming more responsibility as her skills developed. In 1899, at 19 years of age, she married Samuel Finch, a farmer from a neighboring community who had inherited 40 acres of marginal land near the James River. The marriage produced no children during its 5 years, a fact that neighbors later recalled struck them as unusual given Cordelia's profession. In August 1904, Samuel Finch drowned in the James River under circumstances recorded as accidental. According to the death certificate signed by a physician in Cassville, Samuel had been fishing alone when he apparently slipped on wet rocks and struck his head before falling into the water. Cordelia discovered his body the following morning when he failed to return home. She collected a modest life insurance payment and sold the farm within 3 months of his death. By early 1905, Cordelia had relocated to the community of Blue Eye in Stone County, where she established herself as a midwife serving the isolated farms and settlements in the surrounding hills. Her reputation grew quickly as a competent and discreet practitioner who would travel considerable distances in difficult conditions to attend women in labor. However, interviews conducted in 1987 with descendants of Blue Eye residents revealed subtle observations passed down through generations. Several families recalled that Cordelia showed unusual interest in deaths as well as births, frequently offering to prepare bodies for burial when no undertaker was available in the remote areas she served. She was remembered as skilled in this work, perhaps too skilled for someone whose training was supposedly limited to midwifery, and she seemed to linger over these tasks longer than seemed necessary. The earliest letter in the collection was dated the 7th of March 1908 and appeared entirely professional in nature. Cordelia wrote to Vernon regarding the body of an elderly woman she had prepared for transport to his funeral parlor in Galena, inquiring about his availability and fees. Vernon's response, dated March 12th, confirmed the arrangements but included an unexpected addition. He complimented Cordelia's preparation work in specific technical detail, noting that the body had arrived in superior condition and that her suturing of the jaw was particularly skillful. He expressed curiosity about where she had received such thorough training. Cordelia's reply revealed that she had taught herself through observation and practice, adding that she found the work far more satisfying than attending the living. This exchange established the foundation for what would follow. Over the subsequent weeks, letters passed between them with increasing frequency, each gradually revealing perspectives on death that departed significantly from social and religious norms of the era. Vernon wrote in late March that he had chosen his profession not from family obligation alone, but because he found a peace in the company of the deceased that he could not achieve among the living. Cordelia responded that she understood this sentiment precisely, confessing that she often felt more comfortable preparing the dead than delivering the living. By April, the coded language they initially employed began to give way to more direct expression. Vernon wrote of the particular tranquility of the deceased, their stillness and silence, and complete vulnerability. Cordelia replied that she found beauty in that vulnerability, a purity uncorrupted by the demands and deceptions of the living. She admitted that she sometimes delayed her work simply to remain in their presence longer. These early letters reveal two individuals recognizing in each other a shared condition they had each believed unique to themselves. The relief and excitement evident in their words is palpable, the sense of finally being understood by another human being. What that mutual understanding would ultimately produce remained, in these initial exchanges, still unspoken. The letters from summer and fall of 1908 marked a dramatic shift in both tone and content that investigators in 1987 found deeply disturbing to review. What had begun as carefully worded philosophical exchanges gave way to correspondence so explicit that the Missouri State Bureau of Investigation restricted access to these portions of the collection, permitting only senior investigators and consulting psychologists to examine them. The two correspondents abandoned all caution during this period, describing their attractions and activities in detail that left no ambiguity about the nature of their compulsions. Vernon wrote of his opportunities within the funeral parlor, the privacy afforded by his profession, and the trust placed in him by grieving families. Cordelia described incidents in isolated farmhouses where she prepared bodies before families arrived, the hours she had alone with her subjects in remote locations where no one would interrupt or question the duration of her work. Both confessed that they had harbored these desires since adolescence, each believing themselves uniquely afflicted, cursed with urges they could never speak aloud. The relief evident in their words at finding a kindred spirit was profound and unsettling to those who later read them. They wrote of feeling finally understood, finally seen, as though they had wandered through life in isolation until that moment of recognition. Investigators noted that the letters from this period referenced specific incidents involving specific individuals, though both writers were careful never to include names. Vernon referenced subjects by physical descriptions and dates of service. Cordelia used similar methods, noting locations and circumstances. The clinical detachment with which they discussed their activities, combined with the evident excitement they derived from sharing these accounts, presented a psychological profile that consulting experts described as deeply pathological and profoundly dangerous. A letter dated the 3rd of December 1908 marked a pivotal moment in the relationship between Vernon Acker and Cordelia Finch. After 9 months of increasingly intimate correspondence, Vernon proposed what he termed a formalization of their arrangement. He suggested they coordinate their activities systematically, sharing information about opportunities as they arose in their respective practices and providing detailed accounts of their experiences for mutual appreciation. He argued that their partnership could be mutually beneficial in practical terms as well as emotional ones, each alerting the other to subjects of particular interest who came into their care. Cordelia's response, dated December 8th, expressed enthusiastic agreement with Vernon's proposal. She wrote that she had been contemplating a similar suggestion but had hesitated to voice it, fearing she might presume too much upon their connection. She embraced the idea of coordination fully and proposed they establish additional measures to protect their correspondence from accidental discovery. The two developed a coded system for their letters, using innocuous terms for their activities and subjects that would appear to any casual reader as ordinary professional consultation. They also agreed to destroy letters after reading them, a practice they apparently abandoned at some point given the volume of correspondence that survived. Most significantly, they decided to meet in person for the first time despite having exchanged dozens of letters over 9 months. Vernon provided instructions for Cordelia to travel to Galena under the pretense of consulting with him about a difficult preparation case she had encountered. She was to arrive on December 18th and take a room at the boarding house near the train depot. A letter, dated December 21st, written in Cordelia's hand, described their first meeting and its outcome. She confirmed that they had established a physical relationship in addition to their epistolary one, and that they had spent considerable time discussing their shared practices and future plans. The letter expressed profound satisfaction with the encounter and affirmed her complete commitment to their partnership and its unusual purposes moving forward. The 1987 investigation undertook a comprehensive examination of death records from Stone County and surrounding areas between 1909 and 1910, searching for patterns that might connect to the activities described in the letters. What investigators discovered was deeply troubling. During this 18-month period, the death rate in the areas served by Vernon Acker and Cordelia Finch showed a notable elevation compared to both previous years and neighboring counties. More significantly, several deaths that had been attributed to natural causes or accidents exhibited characteristics that, in retrospect, appeared suspicious. Young women in apparently good health died suddenly of what was recorded as heart failure, a diagnosis that required no autopsy and raised few questions in that era. Elderly patients under Cordelia's care as midwife declined unexpectedly after she began attending them for minor ailments unrelated to childbirth. Travelers passing through the area died in accidents with no witnesses. The case that investigators examined most closely was that of Martha Hendricks, age 19, who died in February 1909. According to records, Martha had been suffering from a mild respiratory ailment when her family summoned Cordelia to attend her. Cordelia visited the Hendricks farm on 3 occasions over 5 days, and on the 3rd visit found Martha deceased. The death certificate was signed by a physician in Cassville, over 30 miles distant, who, by his own records, never examined the body but relied upon Cordelia's account of the symptoms and progression. Martha was buried 2 days later, following preparation by Cordelia and funeral services conducted by Vernon Acker. The letters from this period contained passages that investigators found deeply disturbing in light of these deaths. In late February 1909, Vernon wrote to Cordelia praising her for a gift she had sent to him, describing it in their coded language, but with implications about its nature that suggested she had provided him access to a subject she had attended. The enthusiasm in his words and his detailed appreciation of the gift left little doubt about what had transpired. Letters from spring and summer 1909 revealed a significant escalation in the scope and organization of their activities. What had begun as opportunistic exploitation of their professional access evolved during this period into something far more systematic and deliberate. Vernon wrote in April of modifications he had made to his funeral parlor, describing the construction of a private preparation room in the rear of the building, accessible only through his personal residence. He alone possessed the key to this room, and he assured Cordelia that he could spend extended periods there without risk of interruption or discovery. The room was equipped with specialized lighting and furnishings that he described in terms that made their purpose unmistakably clear. Cordelia's letters from this period detailed her efforts to establish what she termed a network of informants throughout the isolated communities she served. She cultivated relationships with elderly patients, isolated families, and lonely widows who would notify her immediately when deaths occurred in their vicinity, often before other family members or authorities were aware. This advance notice provided her with opportunities to arrive first and spend extended time alone with subjects before others became involved. She wrote with evident satisfaction about cases where she had been present at the moment of death and thus had complete access without any prior handling by others. Perhaps most disturbing to investigators was the methodical nature of the correspondence during this period. The 2 correspondents discussed their preferences regarding physical types and conditions with clinical detachment, as though comparing notes on any professional matter. They evaluated subjects using criteria they had apparently developed together, rating their experiences and refining their methods. This rationality and organization suggested minds that had moved far beyond impulsive gratification of compulsion into calculated predation. Several letters contained passages indicating they were no longer content to wait for natural opportunities, but were actively seeking and possibly creating them, identifying potential subjects and discussing methods to ensure access. Despite the isolation and limited communication that characterized Stone County in that era, subtle indications from historical records suggest that not everyone in the community was oblivious to the irregularities occurring around them. The 1987 investigation uncovered several documents showing that questions were being raised, though none led to meaningful scrutiny at the time. In August 1909, the Springfield newspaper published a letter from a Stone County resident whose name was withheld, questioning why so many young people in the southern part of the county were dying of heart failure. The writer noted that in his 60 years of life in the Ozarks, he had never seen so many healthy young persons taken suddenly by weak hearts, and he wondered if some illness was spreading that the medical profession had failed to identify. The letter prompted no investigation and was not followed by any editorial response. More significantly, a formal complaint was filed with the Stone County Sheriff in July 1909 by the family of Clara Dawson, a 23-year-old woman who had died while under Cordelia's care for a minor infection. The complaint, preserved in county records recovered during the 1952 courthouse renovation, stated that when the family prepared Clara for viewing, they discovered unexplained marks on her body that had not been present before Cordelia attended her. The family demanded an investigation into the circumstances of Clara's death and Cordelia's treatment. Sheriff Whitfield's response, also preserved in the records, dismissed the complaint entirely. He noted that Cordelia Finch was a respected professional who had served the community faithfully for years, and that the marks described were entirely consistent with medical treatment and preparation of the body for burial. No further action was taken. The letters reveal that Vernon learned of this complaint and wrote to Cordelia with urgent warnings. He admonished her to be more careful in her methods and suggested a temporary cessation of their activities until any lingering suspicion in the community had fully subsided. Letters from late 1909 revealed significant tension developing between Vernon and Cordelia, their partnership straining under the weight of disagreements both practical and philosophical. Vernon's letters from October and November contained repeated complaints that Cordelia was taking unnecessary risks in her activities and citing the Dawson family complaint as evidence that her methods were attracting dangerous attention. He accused her of becoming reckless, of allowing her compulsions to override her judgment, and of jeopardizing everything they had built together through carelessness. Cordelia's responses were sharp and defensive. She accused Vernon of becoming possessive and controlling, of attempting to dictate terms to her as though she were subordinate in their arrangement rather than an equal partner. She pointed out that he enjoyed the safety of his funeral parlor with its locked private room while she operated in the field under far more difficult and exposed conditions. She suggested that his caution was actually cowardice and that he was content to let her take all the risks while he received the benefits. The arguments escalated into deeply disturbing territory. In one exchange from November, they debated the morality of actively causing deaths versus merely taking advantage of those that occurred naturally. Cordelia argued that if their desires were natural, which she insisted they were, then acting to fulfill those desires was also natural regardless of the means required. Vernon countered that there was a significant distinction between what he termed pure appreciation and what amounted to murder for procurement. He argued for restraint and patience, insisting that sufficient opportunities arose naturally without the need to create them. Cordelia dismissed this position as arbitrary and hypocritical, pushing for expansion of their activities rather than limitation. These philosophical and practical disagreements threatened to dissolve their partnership entirely. Several letters from this period end abruptly or contain passages that have been heavily crossed out, suggesting heated emotions and words that were reconsidered. Yet, despite these conflicts, expressions of continued attraction and mutual need persisted, binding them together even as their alliance frayed. The death that would ultimately trigger the end of their operation occurred in January 1910. Elmira Sutton was 22 years old, married for 3 years to Robert Sutton, a livestock trader whose business required frequent travel throughout southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. By all accounts, Elmira was healthy and vigorous, known in her community for her energetic disposition and robust constitution. In early January, Robert departed for a trading trip expected to last 2 weeks. 4 days after his departure, Cordelia Finch was summoned to the Sutton farm by a neighbor who reported that Elmira had taken ill. According to the death certificate filed with the county, Elmira died on January 9th of apparent heart failure, attended in her final hours by Cordelia. The body was prepared by Cordelia at the farm and transported to Vernon's funeral parlor in Galena, where services were held on January 12th. Elmira was interred in the Galena Cemetery on January 13th. The letters from this period revealed the truth behind these official records. Correspondence between Vernon and Cordelia showed that they had extended interaction with Elmira's remains spanning over a week, passing her between them and describing their experiences in terms that investigators found profoundly disturbing. The delay in burial was explained to the community as awaiting Robert's return, though no genuine effort to contact him was documented. Robert Sutton arrived home on January 18th to discover his wife dead and buried without his knowledge or presence. His reaction was immediate and violent. He confronted Cordelia at her residence, accusing her of negligence at minimum and darker acts at worst. He filed formal complaints with Sheriff Whitfield demanding investigation into the circumstances of Elmira's death, and he publicly vowed to uncover the truth regardless of what authorities did. Vernon's letters from late January reflect mounting panic. He urged Cordelia to immediately destroy all evidence of their correspondence, warning that Robert Sutton was a determined man who would not rest until he had answers and that their entire operation was now in jeopardy. Robert Sutton's actions in the weeks following his wife's death were reconstructed by the 1987 investigation through county records and family accounts preserved through generations. Sutton was described by contemporaries as a methodical and determined man, qualities that served him well in the livestock trade and that he now directed toward uncovering the truth about Elmira's death. His first official action was to request exhumation of his wife's body for examination by a physician of his choosing. The request, filed with the Stone County prosecutor in late January 1910, was denied for lack of evidence, suggesting foul play. The prosecutor noted that a death certificate had been properly filed, that the attending caregiver was a respected professional, and that grief sometimes led bereaved spouses to seek explanations where none existed. Undeterred, Sutton began his own investigation. He traveled throughout the county visiting families who had lost members while under Cordelia's care, and he found several who shared his suspicions. The family of Clara Dawson, whose complaint had been dismissed the previous summer, provided him with details of the unexplained marks they had discovered. Other families reported similar concerns they had kept private, fearing they would not be believed. Sutton compiled these accounts and attempted to present them to Sheriff Whitfield, who again declined to take action without concrete evidence. In late February, Sutton confronted Vernon Acker directly at the funeral parlor, accusing him of complicity in Elmira's death and demanding to know what had been done with her body during the week it remained in his custody. The confrontation became physical, and Sutton was briefly arrested for assault. A letter from Vernon dated March 1st described this confrontation to Cordelia, expressing fear that Sutton would eventually find proof of their activities if he continued his investigation unchecked. The letter noted that Sutton had spoken of traveling to Springfield to consult with attorneys about legal action. Cordelia's response, dated March 4th, was chilling in its directness, urging Vernon to take decisive action to silence the threat permanently before it destroyed them both. The mysterious events of March 1910 brought an abrupt end to both Robert Sutton's investigation and the correspondence between Vernon and Cordelia. On March 8th, Robert Sutton departed his farm for Springfield, where he had arranged consultations with 2 attorneys regarding civil action against Vernon Acker and potentially criminal complaints against Cordelia Finch. He told neighbors he expected to return within 3 days. He was never seen again. When Sutton failed to return after a week, his brother traveled from Cassville to investigate. The route to Springfield was searched extensively, but no trace of Robert Sutton, his horse, or his traveling effects was ever discovered. Sheriff Whitfield recorded his disappearance as unexplained, speculating that he might have met with foul play from robbers on the road or perhaps chosen to abandon his grief-stricken life and start anew elsewhere. The case was never solved, and his body was never recovered. Within days of Sutton's disappearance, Cordelia Finch departed Blue Eye suddenly and permanently. She left a note with a neighbor claiming she had received word that a relative in Kansas had fallen gravely ill and required her care. She gave no forwarding address and asked that her few possessions be sold, with proceeds donated to the local church. Despite later efforts by the 1987 investigation, no confirmed trace of Cordelia Finch was ever found in Kansas or elsewhere. She had effectively vanished, likely assuming a new identity as she had done once before. Vernon Acker alone remained. He continued to operate his funeral parlor in Galena until his death from pneumonia in 1923, never charged with any crime, never publicly suspected of wrongdoing. The final letter in the collection, dated the 15th of March 1910, was from Cordelia, written in a hand that investigators noted appeared hurried. It thanked Vernon for solving their problem, a phrase whose meaning was unmistakable in context. She promised to contact him once established in her new location so they might resume their partnership. No evidence exists that she ever did. The official investigation launched following the discovery of the letters in September 1987 was the most extensive examination of a historical crime ever conducted by the Missouri State Bureau of Investigation. Forensic document analysts confirmed the authenticity of the correspondence through paper composition analysis, ink dating, and handwriting comparison with known samples of Vernon Acker's script obtained from funeral home records preserved in the county archives. The letters were definitively dated to the period between 1908 and 1910, eliminating any possibility of modern fabrication. Investigators attempted to identify specific victims from the descriptions contained in the letters, but this effort was severely hampered by incomplete death records from the era. Many deaths in rural Stone County were never officially recorded, and those that were often lacked a detail beyond name, date, and a general cause. Despite these limitations, investigators identified 11 individuals whose deaths corresponded to descriptions in the correspondence with reasonable certainty. Court orders were obtained to exhume 3 of these individuals, including Elmira Sutton. The exhumations, conducted under the supervision of forensic anthropologists from the University of Missouri, revealed evidence of post-mortem interference consistent with the activities described in the letters. Specific findings were sealed by court order due to their disturbing nature, but the lead investigator confirmed publicly that the physical evidence corroborated the written accounts. Extensive searches were conducted for any grave or remains of Robert Sutton along the route between his farm and Springfield, utilizing both ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect old remains. No trace was ever found. Similarly, investigators attempted to trace Cordelia Finch's movements after her departure from Blue Eye in March 1910. Possible matches were identified in Kansas and later California, women of similar age and description working as midwives or nurses, but none could be confirmed as Cordelia. She had covered her tracks thoroughly. The case technically remains open in Missouri law enforcement files, but with no living suspects to prosecute, it exists primarily as a historical record of crimes that justice never reached. The 1987 investigation consulted extensively with criminologists, psychologists, and historians to analyze the Acker and Finch case within broader contexts of criminal pathology and historical circumstances. Dr. Margaret Holloway, a forensic psychologist from Washington University in St. Louis, examined the correspondence and provided a detailed assessment of both individuals. She noted that the letters revealed a complete absence of remorse or moral conflict regarding their activities, replaced instead by elaborate rationalizations, framing their compulsions as natural expressions of appreciation for the deceased rather than violations. Both correspondents displayed characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder, including superficial charm in their professional dealings, manipulativeness, and an inability to recognize the humanity of their victims. Dr. Holloway observed that their partnership was particularly dangerous because it provided mutual validation, each reinforcing the other's belief that their desires were acceptable and their actions justified. Criminologist Dr. James Whitfield of the University of Missouri compared the case to other historical instances of similar paraphilias, noting that, while rare, such cases appeared periodically in the historical record, often involving individuals with professional access to the deceased. He emphasized that the isolation and limited oversight characteristic of rural communities in that era created ideal conditions for such predators to operate undetected. There were no licensing requirements for undertakers or midwives, no mandatory reporting procedures for deaths, and no systematic oversight of those who handled human remains. Bodies were entrusted entirely to the care of individuals whose qualifications and character were assumed rather than verified. Historians consulted on the case reflected on how many similar crimes may have occurred throughout American history without ever being discovered. The circumstances that allowed Acker and Finch to operate, geographic isolation, implicit trust in professionals, limited law enforcement resources, and inadequate death investigation procedures, were common throughout rural America well into the 20th century. The discovery of these letters was essentially accidental, and experts agreed that for every case that comes to light, countless others likely remain buried in unmarked graves and destroyed correspondence, their victims violated without record or remembrance. The aftermath of the 987 revelations sent shockwaves through Stone County, where many residents discovered they were descended from families mentioned in the letters. The investigation required notification of descendants of the identified victims, conversations that investigators later described as among the most difficult of their careers. Families who had accepted natural causes for generations were forced to confront the possibility that their ancestors had been victimized in ways almost too disturbing to comprehend. Some families requested and received detailed information about their forebears, while others chose to know nothing beyond the basic facts. The decision was made by the Missouri State Bureau of Investigation in consultation with the prosecutor's office and the state archives, not to publicly release the full correspondence. The graphic content and the potential to identify descendants of victims were cited as primary concerns, along with fears that publication might inspire imitation or cause unnecessary trauma to communities still processing the revelations. The farmhouse site where the letters were discovered remains privately owned agricultural land, unmarked and unremarkable. The demolished structure now just a memory held by those who worked on it that September day. In the years following the investigation, unverified reports emerged of descendants of Cordelia Finch coming forward with family stories passed down through generations. These accounts suggested she had continued her practices elsewhere under different identities, possibly in Kansas, California, and Oregon, though none could be substantiated with documentary evidence. If true, the full scope of her crimes may never be known. The correspondence now resides in a restricted section of the Missouri State Archives, accessible only to qualified researchers with demonstrated scholarly purpose. The letters remained sealed from public view, but the truth they contained has finally emerged into light after nearly 80 years of darkness. The case stands as a chilling reminder of the violation that occurs when trust placed in professionals is betrayed, when those charged with caring for the dead instead view them as objects for gratification. Even in death, dignity can be stolen, and the Acker and Finch letters testify to that theft with terrible clarity.